404 years before our era. A deep, still Phrygian night, thick and black as ink, is saturated with the smell of char and dry pine resin. Here, in the heart of the Persian Empire, far from the splendors of Athens and the harsh simplicity of Sparta, a man who once held the destiny of all Greece in the palm of his hand is living out his final hours in a small, fortified estate. His name is Alcibiades. His sleep is troubled, haunted by a mix of the roaring Athenian crowds proclaiming him a savior and the icy silence of the Spartan war council, listening intently to his treacherous advice. Suddenly, he is woken not by a sound, but by a sensation, a heat searing through the wooden walls. He leaps to his feet, and through the window sees not stars, but the sinister orange dance of flames already engulfing his refuge. He does not ask who or why. He knows. The ghosts of his past, clad in the flesh of hired assassins, have come to collect their debt. It is Sparta, which no longer needs his genius and now fears it. It is the new tyrants of Athens, his former comrades, for whom he is too dangerous a witness. It is the Persians, playing their own game, in which he no longer has a place. In this moment, standing amidst the roaring fire, a short sword in one hand and his cloak wrapped around the other as a makeshift shield, he embodies the entire tragic paradox of his life. Here he is, the darling of Athens, the most beautiful, the most intelligent, the most charismatic man of his time, the one who was forgiven everything, now hunted, alone, betrayed by all, trapped in a fiery snare at the edge of the civilized world. How? How did the demigod of Athenian democracy turn into a wild beast hunted across all of Asia? The answer to that question is not the story of a single man, but an epic saga of glory, pride, and the greatest betrayal in the history of the ancient world. A saga that began in a world already on the brink of self-destruction. To understand the tragedy of Alcibiades, one must first understand the world that created him. A world split in two by the greatest conflict in the history of ancient Greece. This was the latter half of the 5th century BC, an era historians would call the Peloponnesian War. On the world's chessboard stood two titanic figures, two poles of the Hellenic world. On one side, Athens, the head of a vast naval empire, democracy in its most radical, turbulent, and dangerous form. Athens was a city of philosophers and poets, a city where the Parthenon shone in the sun as a symbol of its cultural supremacy. But it was also a city of merchants, demagogues, and relentless expansionists, whose triremes, like birds of prey, controlled the entire Aegean Sea, collecting tribute from dozens of allied city-states that had long since become vassals. Athenian power was built on silver, timber, and human audacity. On the other side of the board stood Sparta, its complete opposite. A land-based power, a closed, militarized society built on the harshest discipline and the total subordination of the individual to the state. Sparta was like a clenched fist, its strength lying in the unbreakable phalanx of its hoplites, who were raised from childhood to be perfect warriors, knowing neither luxury nor fear. This conflict was not simply a war for territory or resources. It was a clash of two civilizations, two ideologies, two views on the very essence of human existence: democracy versus oligarchy, openness versus isolation, navy versus army, individualism versus collectivism. And Alcibiades was born in the very heart of this storm, in Athens, at the moment the city reached the peak of its power under the great Pericles. He absorbed Athenian arrogance with his mother's milk, a belief in his own exceptionalism, and a contempt for his enemies. He was a product of this era, an age of great achievements and monstrous cruelty, where genius and madness walked hand in hand. And it was this boiling cauldron of ambition, fear, and pride that would become the stage for his incredible rise and even more devastating fall. He was not just an Athenian, he was the scion of Athens' highest aristocracy, the heir to one of the most illustrious and, at the same time, most controversial families in the city's history. Alcibiades belonged to the Alcmaeonids, a dynasty that had given Athens the great reformer, Cleisthenes, the founding father of Athenian democracy, and Pericles himself, the first citizen of Athens, whose era became the city's golden age. His lineage was impeccable, opening every door for him and placing him at the center of public attention from birth. However, an ancient curse also hung over the Alcmaeonids, the so-called Cylonian affair, an accusation of sacrilege committed by their ancestors many generations ago. This curse, whether real or imagined, was a convenient weapon for political enemies, who could at any moment remind the people of the Alcmaeonids' tainted blood. Having lost his father in battle at an early age, the young Alcibiades was taken into the home of his famous uncle, Pericles, to be raised. He grew up at the epicenter of Athens' political and intellectual life, listening to the debates of philosophers, generals, and poets. He saw how Pericles could calm a raging crowd in the agora with a single word, how he managed a vast empire, how he erected timeless temples on the Acropolis. It was the best school of power imaginable. But if Pericles was the embodiment of Athenian wisdom and restraint, Sophrosyne, then Alcibiades became his antithesis. He took from his environment the most dangerous lesson, a belief that he, as a member of the Golden Youth, was permitted anything, that rules were written for ordinary people, but not for him. His dazzling beauty, which was the subject of legends, only worsened the situation, accustoming him from childhood to universal adoration and worship. He was the golden boy, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, in the house that ruled the world. This legacy was both his greatest gift and his fatal curse, for it cultivated his genius, but gave him no moral compass by which to control it. In the bustling intellectual cauldron of 5th century Athens, where Western philosophy was born on the public squares and in the gymnasiums, one of the most brilliant and unusual figures was Socrates. This homely, barefoot philosopher, who resembled a satyr, possessed an incredible magnetism that drew the city's most talented youth to him, and none of his students fascinated and troubled him as much as Alcibiades. Their relationship, described in detail by Plato in the dialogues Symposium and Alcibiades en Force Avart, was more than just the friendship of a teacher and his student. It was a battle for a soul. Socrates, unlike the fawning crowds, saw more than just a beautiful exterior in Alcibiades. Beneath it, he discerned a mind of incredible sharpness, a will of titanic strength, and an ambition capable of turning the world upside down. The philosopher understood that such a man, with such potential, could become either the greatest blessing for Athens or its most terrible curse. Socrates was the only person, by Alcibiades' own admission, of whom he was ashamed. In his presence, the self-assured aristocrat felt the utter emptiness of his life, a life devoted to the pursuit of cheap popularity and pleasure. Socrates tried to convince him that true greatness lay not in power over others, but in power over oneself, in the knowledge of virtue. For Alcibiades, he was a living omen, the voice of conscience, pointing to the fork in the road of his destiny. But the temptations of the world were too great. On one side of the scale were stern conversations about justice and the good. On the other, the adoration of the crowd, lavish feasts, political intrigues, and the promise of military glory. Alcibiades was torn between these two worlds. He could weep at Socrates' words, realizing his own worthlessness, only to start a drunken brawl the next day or commit another outrageous act just to draw attention to himself. This internal struggle was a prelude to the life he would lead. He would forever be torn between brilliant insights and base passions, between serving a great idea and indulging his own ego. Socrates foresaw the tragedy. He saw that the love of the Athenian people, their worship, was corrupting his student, turning his potential into poison. The philosopher tried to be an anchor for this ship sailing at full speed, but in the end, the storm of ambition proved stronger. The character of Alcibiades was forged in a unique environment where extremes converged. His physical beauty was so exceptional that ancient authors like Plutarch write of it as a phenomenon that lasted through every stage of his life, from childhood to maturity. But for him, this beauty was not just a gift, but his first and most effective weapon. He understood from an early age that his appearance was disarming, inspiring affection and forgiveness where another would be condemned. This fostered in him a deep-seated belief in his own impunity, a sense that he was allowed more than others. His famous arrogance was the other side of this adoration. He behaved like a prince in a republic, committing acts that shocked Athenian society, but at the same time fascinated it with their audacity. He could strike a respected citizen on a dare, cut off the tail of his expensive dog just to make the whole city talk about that, instead of his more serious misdeeds, or show up at a banquet in a state of extreme intoxication. Every such stunt was a carefully calculated act of self-promotion, a way to keep the public's attention fixed on him. He instinctively understood the laws of the crowd, that it loves not only heroes, but charming rogues as well. In this forge of character, his sharp mind was honed not for the service of the state, but for its manipulation. He learned to say what people wanted to hear, to play on the fears and hopes of the citizens, turning the public assembly into a one-man show. His charisma was hypnotic. He could convince the Athenians of anything, even the most risky and reckless ventures. But behind this brilliant facade lurked a dangerous void. Raised in luxury and permissiveness, he lacked an inner core, a set of firm moral principles. His only measure of good and evil was his own desire. His only goal was glory. He was like a mirror, reflecting all the vices and ambitions of his city, its drive for domination, its love of grand gestures, and its perilous self-confidence. Athens itself had created Alcibiades, nurtured him with its admiration, and in the future, it would reap the bitter fruits of this upbringing. Despite his outrageous lifestyle, Alcibiades wasn't a coward. He craved glory, and in the Athens of his time, the surest path to it lay on the battlefield. His baptism by fire came as a young man at the Battle of Potidæa, one of the first major engagements of the Peloponnesian War. He went there as a young hoplite, eager to prove his valor. In that same battle, in the same formation, fighting shoulder to shoulder with him, was his mentor and friend, Socrates. This proximity on the battlefield was symbolic: philosophy and untamed ambition, wisdom and audacity, standing together against enemy spears. During a fierce clash, the Athenian contingent was pushed back, and Alcibiades, who had been fighting bravely, was wounded and fell to the ground. He would have been inevitably killed or captured if not for Socrates. The philosopher, already a man of some years, showed incredible courage. He single-handedly shielded the wounded youth with his own body, fighting off enemies until help arrived. He saved not just his student, he saved the future of Athens, or, as it would later turn out, its doom. This episode had significant consequences. First, it demonstrated to everyone that Alcibiades was not just a spoiled aristocrat, but a brave warrior willing to risk his life for his country. Second, when the time came to award honors for valor, Socrates, who had rightfully earned the victor's wreath, insisted that the prize be given to Alcibiades. He did this to encourage the young man's ambition, to channel his energy toward the pursuit of military glory and service to the state. But this noble act had an inverse effect. Alcibiades, already prone to narcissism, received yet another confirmation of his exceptionalism. He was not just saved, he was saved by the city's greatest sage, who then ceded his own glory to him. This experience of first blood and first triumph, earned in essence by another's valor, only strengthened his belief that fate itself had destined him for great things, and that others, even the most worthy, were meant to serve as pedestals for his greatness. To fully understand the motives that drove Alcibiades, and to unravel the paradox of his betrayals, one must look deep into his soul and identify the inner demon that defined his every action. This demon was not a thirst for money, nor a desire for tyrannical power in the classical sense, nor even an ideological hatred of democracy. His primary, all-consuming passion was philotimia, an ancient Greek concept that translates to love of honor, but in his case, it mutated into an insatiable, pathological thirst for glory, recognition, and primacy. Alcibiades had to be first in everything: the most handsome, the most courageous, the most eloquent, the most influential. He could not bear it when someone else was the center of attention. The entire world, and Athens above all, was for him merely a mirror in which he wished to see the reflection of his own greatness. This trait made him an incredibly effective politician and commander when his personal ambitions coincided with the interests of the state. He was ready for any feat, any desperate risk, if it promised him glory. But this same trait made him monstrously dangerous. His loyalty was not to the Athenian people, not to its democratic institutions, not to the city's patron gods. His only deity was himself. Athens wasn't a homeland he loved with selfless devotion, but the grandest stage upon which he could enact the drama of his triumph. As long as this stage granted him the leading role, as long as the crowd applauded him, he was ready to serve it with genius and courage. But the moment his status, his glory, or his life was threatened, as in the case of the accusations of sacrilege, his loyalty instantly evaporated. He felt no remorse in betraying Athens, because in his distorted view of the world, it was Athens that had betrayed him by denying him his right to be first. This inner demon, this obsession with his own I, is the key to the puzzle. He was not a villain in the pure sense. He was a tragic figure, a kind of Narcissus with a sword in his hand, so in love with his own reflection in the eyes of the world that he was willing to shatter the world itself just to keep that reflection from dimming. The political career of Alcibiades began with an act that perfectly demonstrated his character, an act of destruction. After 10 years of grueling war, Athens and Sparta signed the so-called Peace of Nicias. It was a fragile truce, negotiated by the cautious and respected Athenian general Nicias. For the war-weary city-states, it was a chance to recover, to catch their breath. But for the young and ambitious Alcibiades, peace was a catastrophe. In peacetime, his military talents were not in demand, and his thirst for glory remained unquenched. He saw Nicias as his main political rival, and the peace treaty was his rival's triumph. Therefore, Alcibiades, not yet 30 years old, threw all his energy, all his charisma and oratorical skill into shattering this peace. He began to play a complex and cynical diplomatic game. He entered into secret negotiations with Argos, Sparta's traditional enemy in the Peloponnese, and began to forge a new anti-Spartan coalition. When Spartan ambassadors arrived in Athens with peaceful intentions and full authority to resolve all disputes, Alcibiades committed an act of pure political fraud. He met with them in secret, promising his full support in the assembly on one condition. They must conceal the full extent of their powers and say they had only come to negotiate. The ambassadors, charmed by his charisma and trusting his promises, agreed. The next day in the assembly, Alcibiades staged a performance. He publicly asked the ambassadors what powers they had brought. When they, following his instructions, replied that they had no authority to make final decisions, Alcibiades turned on them with feigned anger, accusing them of duplicity and treachery. He portrayed them as liars, and Sparta as a state that could not be trusted. The assembly was furious. The Spartan ambassadors were humiliated and expelled, and the peace treaty was effectively torn to shreds. Thus, simply to undermine the authority of his rival Nicias and clear his own path to glory, Alcibiades plunged Greece back into the abyss of war. The zenith of Alcibiades' influence, his greatest triumph, and simultaneously the beginning of his end, was the Sicilian Expedition. At the height of the new wave of war that he himself had provoked, Alcibiades proposed in the assembly the most grandiose and adventurous project in Athenian history. He suggested sending a massive fleet and army to Sicily, ostensibly to help the allied city of Segesta in its conflict with Syracuse, an ally of Sparta. But Alcibiades' true goals were far more ambitious. In his dreams, this was not just a local intervention, but the first step toward creating a great Western empire. He dreamed of conquering not only Sicily, but also Carthage and Italy, of subjugating the entire Mediterranean to Athens, and gaining control of inexhaustible resources that would allow him to finally crush Sparta. It was a plan that staggered the imagination with its audacity and scale. His main opponent, the cautious Nicias, argued vehemently against it, pointing to the enormous risk, the colossal expense, and the danger of fighting a war on two fronts. But Athens was already under Alcibiades' spell. He took the stage and delivered a speech that was a masterpiece of demagoguery. He played on the pride of the Athenians, on their imperial ambitions, on their greed. He painted pictures of a fabulously wealthy island just waiting to be taken. He spoke to the youth of glory and adventure, to the merchants of new markets, and to the entire populace of the greatness that awaited them across the sea. His energy, his confidence, his charisma were irresistible. The Athenians, seized by a collective madness, voted not just for the expedition, but for outfitting the largest and most expensive fleet that had ever left the harbor of Piraeus. Hundreds of triremes, thousands of hoplites, and sailors. It was Alcibiades' moment of absolute triumph. He stood at the pinnacle of the world, having received from his city a mandate to realize his insane dream. But it was precisely at this moment of hubris that fate was already preparing a blow that would cast him down from the heavens. Just as Athens was gripped by euphoria and the feverish preparations for the greatest campaign in its history, shadows gathered over the city. One morning, shortly before the fleet was to set sail, the Athenians awoke to a horrific discovery. All over the city, the Hermae had been mutilated. These were stone pillars bearing the head of the god Hermes and a phallus, considered sacred guardians that protected homes, crossroads, and borders. Most of the statues had their faces smashed. For the superstitious Greeks, this was not just an act of vandalism, but a monstrous sacrilege, a terrible omen that threatened the divine favor of the entire Sicilian expedition. Panic and paranoia seized the city. Who could have committed such an organized and brazen desecration? The political enemies of Alcibiades immediately seized the opportunity. Rumors began to spread. It was said to be the work of aristocratic clubs known for their drunken debauchery and contempt for democracy. The name of Alcibiades, famous for his dissolute lifestyle, naturally came up. Furthermore, informants came forward, claiming that he and his friends had held parodies of the sacred Eleusinian mysteries in private homes, which was considered an even graver crime. There was no direct evidence linking him to the mutilation of the Hermae, and it was most likely a well-planned provocation by his opponents. But the shadow of suspicion fell upon him. His enemies demanded an immediate trial. Alcibiades, understanding the danger of his position, demanded the trial be held before the fleet sailed, while he was still in the city and could defend himself, while the army that idolized him was still present. But his opponents were more cunning. They insisted he depart on the campaign first, arguing that such an important enterprise could not be delayed. Their calculation was simple. In his absence, it would be far easier to turn public opinion against him and secure a guilty verdict. Alcibiades, now a hostage to his own dream, was forced to agree. And so, the great fleet, with the shadow of sacrilege hanging over it, sailed from Piraeus. The darling of Athens set off to meet his glory, unaware that behind him, the executioner's axe was already being sharpened. The expedition reached the shores of Sicily, and Alcibiades immediately began to demonstrate his strategic genius, developing bold plans to isolate Syracuse, but he never had the chance to implement them. Soon, the state ship Salaminia arrived at the Athenian camp with an official order. Alcibiades and several of his associates were to return to Athens at once to stand trial on charges of sacrilege. For him, this was the moment of truth, the fateful crossroads that would determine the rest of his life and the fate of Athens. He knew perfectly well what awaited him at home. In his absence, his political enemies had waged a massive campaign to discredit him. The people, terrified by evil omens, were ready to believe any slander. A trial in such an atmosphere would not be justice but a political lynching, one that would almost certainly end with a death sentence. He faced a choice: submit to the laws of his city and essentially commit suicide, or save his life and become an exile and a traitor. And Alcibiades made his choice. He did not obey the order. However, he did not incite a mutiny in the army, which might well have followed him. He acted more shrewdly. He agreed to follow the Salaminia in his own trireme, but during a stop in southern Italy, his ship vanished under the cover of night. He had fled. This escape was his point of no return. In that moment, he ceased to be an Athenian general and citizen. He placed his own survival above his duty to his homeland. Can he be condemned? On the one hand, he was fleeing what he believed to be an unjust trial. On the other, he was abandoning a massive army that he himself had persuaded to embark on this campaign. His flight decapitated the expedition, leaving it under the command of the indecisive and ailing Nicias, which ultimately led to its complete annihilation. But Alcibiades, at that moment, wasn't thinking of Athens. He was thinking of himself. And his next step would shake the entire Hellenic world to its foundations, transforming him from a hero into a monster. Having escaped, Alcibiades did not hide in obscurity. He did the unthinkable, the unimaginable for any Athenian. He went straight into the lion's den, to Sparta. In Athens, he was sentenced to death in absentia, his property was confiscated, and the priests cursed his name. He was now an outlaw, and his only chance for survival and revenge was to offer his services to those who most hated his former homeland. His arrival in Sparta was a sensation. Before the stern and taciturn Spartan kings and ephors stood the very man who embodied everything Athenian: refinement, eloquence, audacity. But Alcibiades instantly transformed himself. He cut his long hair, exchanged his luxurious Athenian robes for a coarse Spartan cloak, began to eat simple food, and spoke in short, laconic phrases. He completely mimicked his new hosts, demonstrating an incredible capacity for adaptation. And he brought them not only his loyalty, but also his genius, poisoned by a thirst for vengeance. He stood before the Spartan assembly and revealed all of Athens's military secrets, all its weaknesses. It was the first, most direct, and most devastating betrayal. The darling of Athens, its most brilliant commander, now stood before its bitterest enemies and methodically explained to them the best way to destroy his native city. He was no longer just a fugitive saving his own life. He became the architect of Athens' ruin. This act drew a permanent line, separating him from his past. The paradox reached its peak. The man who was the heart and soul of Athenian imperialism now voluntarily became its gravedigger. And the Spartans, despite their innate distrust of foreigners, could not help but listen to him, for his words carried the cold glint of truth and the promise of final victory. Alcibiades did not limit himself to general advice. He delivered 2 precise, surgical strikes against Athens that would ultimately determine the outcome of the war. His genius, which should have served the expansion of the Athenian Empire, now worked with devilish efficiency for its destruction. First, he persuaded the Spartans to immediately send their best general, Gylippus, to Sicily with a small but professional force. Alcibiades knew that the Athenian army at Syracuse, deprived of his strategic leadership and left under the command of the hesitant Nicias, was vulnerable. He explained to the Spartans that the arrival of even a small Spartan contingent would inspire the Syracusans, give them confidence, and allow them to turn the tide of the siege. And so it happened. The arrival of Gylippus was the turning point in the Sicilian campaign. He reorganized the defense, defeated the Athenians in several key battles, and ultimately trapped their army, leading to its complete annihilation. The destruction of the Sicilian Expedition was the greatest catastrophe in Athenian history. The city lost tens of thousands of its best soldiers and a huge part of its fleet. It was a blow from which Athens would never fully recover, and its author, in essence, was Alcibiades. Second, he proposed that the Spartans change their entire strategy for the war. Previously, the Spartans had limited themselves to brief annual invasions of Attica during the harvest. Alcibiades advised them to capture and fortify the town of Dicilia, located just a few miles from Athens. The creation of this permanent outpost in the heart of Attica had devastating consequences. Athens found itself in a state of perpetual siege. It lost access to its silver mines, lost control of the countryside, and thousands of slaves defected to the Spartans. The city was forced to survive on expensive food imports by sea, which drained its treasury. Thus, 2 pieces of advice from Alcibiades, one tactical, the other strategic, inflicted more damage on his homeland than all the previous years of war. The genius of Athens had become its angel of death. However, the nature of Alcibiades was such that he could not exist for long in any system that demanded subordination and discipline. Even in harsh, ascetic Sparta, his inner demons, vanity and an inability to restrain himself, gained the upper hand. At first, the Spartans admired his ability to adapt to their way of life, but soon his individualism and Athenian arrogance began to seep through. He could not resist showing off his intellect, demonstrating his superiority, which provoked envy and suspicion among the Spartan elite. The final straw was his most audacious and personal transgression. Taking advantage of the absence of the Spartan king August II, who was with the army in Attica, Alcibiades seduced his wife, Queen Timaya. It was an act of incredible recklessness, a personal insult to one of the most powerful men in Sparta. When Timaya gave birth to a son, rumors spread throughout Sparta that his father was not Augeas, but the Athenian exile. Alcibiades himself, in his usual fashion, not only did not hide it, but boasted that he had done it not out of simple lust, but out of a desire for his descendants to rule Sparta. This was an unprecedented insult to the entire Spartan state system. King Augeas, upon learning of this, conceived a bitter hatred for him and gave secret orders to his commanders in Ionia to kill Alcibiades. Warned of the danger, Alcibiades was once again forced to flee. This episode is telling. He betrayed even those to whom he had betrayed his homeland. His ego, his inability to control his desires, proved stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. He became an exile even among his enemies, proving that his only true homeland and his only object of worship was himself. Now, hunted by both Athenians and Spartans, he took the next step in his odyssey of betrayal, a step that took him to a new level of the geopolitical game. Fleeing Spartan vengeance, Alcibiades found refuge where Greek exiles had sought shelter for centuries, at the court of a Persian satrap. He came to Tissaphernes, the Persian king's governor in Asia Minor, who controlled the vast resources and gold of the Achaemenid Empire. Thus began the second act of his betrayal, even more cynical and complex than the first. If in Sparta he had been an instrument in the hands of the enemy, he now decided to become the puppeteer himself. He once again completely changed his persona, transforming from a stern Spartan ascetic into a pampered Eastern nobleman, adopting Persian customs and luxury. He quickly charmed Tissaphernes with his intelligence and knowledge of Greek affairs, and he offered him a new, cunning strategy. He convinced the satrap that it was not in Persia's interest to allow a complete Spartan victory. For if Sparta, having crushed Athens, became the hegemon of all Greece, it would inevitably turn its gaze toward the rich Persian possessions in Asia. Therefore, Alcibiades advised, Persia should play a double game. It should provide financial aid to Sparta, but only just enough to allow the Spartans to continue the war, not to win it decisively. He advised paying the Spartan sailors' wages irregularly and not in full, so that their fleet would always be on the verge of mutiny. His plan was brilliant in its cynicism. Let the two greatest Greek city-states bleed each other dry, and Persia, playing the role of arbiter, could ultimately subjugate a weakened Greece with little effort. Now he was betraying not only Athens, but also his recent allies, the Spartans. He was playing with the fates of entire nations, based solely on his own interests, which at that moment consisted of creating a situation where both Athens and Sparta would realize they could not do without him. This was the pinnacle of his political artistry and his moral decline. He had become an enemy to all, but simultaneously an indispensable advisor to all, turning the Peloponnesian War into a bloody theater where he was the lead director. While at the court of Tissaphernes, Alcibiades played the most complex game of his life. His ultimate goal was not to serve Persia, but to make a triumphant return to Athens. But he understood that returning to the democratic Athens that had cursed his name was impossible. So he decided to change Athens itself. He began to send secret messages to the commanders of the Athenian fleet, which was based on the island of Samos. He hinted to them that he had immense influence over Tissaphernes and could sway the Persian king to Athens' side, securing an endless flow of gold. But, he said, he would never negotiate with the radical democracy that had exiled him. He would return and bring Athens the Persian alliance only if an oligarchic regime was established in the city. It was an offer that was hard to refuse. The Athenian fleet, composed mainly of middle-class citizens, was in a desperate situation. The treasury was empty, and the Spartans, with Persian support, were building more and more ships. The idea of getting Persian gold and bringing back the most talented commander seemed like salvation. Conspirators in the Athenian army, on Samos, and in Athens itself, seizing on this offer, carried out an oligarchic coup. Democracy was overthrown, and the so-called Council of 400 came to power. Alcibiades, the great puppeteer, had managed to change the political system of his homeland from hundreds of miles away. However, his plan backfired. The new oligarchic rulers, once in power, were in no hurry to bring him back, fearing his popularity and ambition. Moreover, the sailors on Samos, upon learning of the coup, mutinied, restored democracy within the fleet, and declared their loyalty to the old constitution. Athens was on the brink of civil war, an oligarchy in the city, and a democratic fleet in exile. Alcibiades found himself between a rock and a hard place, but it was in this chaotic situation that his genius shone with new force. The situation was paradoxical. In Athens, an oligarchic government ruled, having come to power on the pretext of bringing back Alcibiades, but now it feared him. And at Samos was the democratically minded fleet, which was Athens's last hope, but which was composed of men whose relatives Alcibiades had indirectly condemned to death in Sicily. And it was this fleet, in its desperate situation, that made the most unexpected decision. The sailors and soldiers understood that without money and experienced leadership, they were doomed. They knew that Alcibiades was nearby, and that only he possessed the authority and cunning to negotiate with the Persians or defeat the Spartans. And then the incredible happened. The Democratic Assembly of Soldiers on Samos voted to repeal Alcibiades' death sentence and summon him to be their commander-in-chief. The traitor, the man who had twice switched sides, the man responsible for his city's greatest calamities, was officially called upon to be its savior. When Alcibiades arrived at Samos, he found an army ready to sail immediately to Athens and overthrow the oligarchs. This would have been a catastrophe, a civil war in plain sight of the Spartan fleet that would have utterly destroyed the city. And here, Alcibiades showed himself not as a demagogue, but as a true statesman. He delivered a speech that dissuaded the soldiers from civil strife, convincing them that the main enemy was Sparta. He immediately went to Tissaphernes, now as the official representative of Athens, and began his double game with new vigor, trying to deceive both the Persians and the Spartans. This was a turning point. The paradox of his personality was on full display. The one who had been the chief destroyer had become the only hope for salvation. Athens, which he had betrayed, now reached out to him, begging for help, and he, driven by the same thirst for glory, accepted the challenge. Taking command of a fleet that was in a deplorable state, without money and with morale at rock bottom, Alcibiades worked a true miracle. He transformed from a cunning politician into a brilliant naval commander, proving that his military genius had not faded during his years of exile. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes of his betrayals, he unleashed the full force of his tactical talent upon his enemies. In a series of bold and unexpected maneuvers in the Hellespont region, the modern Dardanelles, through which Athens's vital grain supply from the Black Sea passed, he completely changed the course of the war. The culmination of his military success was the Battle of Cyzicus. Alcibiades devised a cunning plan. He lured the entire Spartan fleet under the command of Mindarus into a trap. First, he attacked with a small part of his forces, then feigned a retreat, drawing the Spartans out into the open sea. At that moment, the main Athenian fleet emerged from behind a headland, cutting off the Spartans' path of escape. Simultaneously, an Athenian landing force, which Alcibiades had put ashore in advance, attacked the Spartan base. The battle was fierce and ended with the complete annihilation of the Peloponnesian fleet. The Spartan admiral, Mindarus, fell in battle. A famously laconic dispatch, intercepted by the Athenians, was sent to Sparta. Ships lost. Mindarus is dead. The men are starving. We know not what to do. This victory was not just a tactical success, it had enormous strategic importance. Athens once again ruled the seas, regained control of the straits, and secured its food supply. This victory was followed by others. Alcibiades reconquered Byzantium and other important cities. In a few short years, the man who had nearly destroyed Athenian power had now single-handedly restored it. The fame of his exploits echoed throughout Greece. The traitor had transformed into an invincible hero, and the path home, to Athens, was now open to him. After 7 years of exile and a string of brilliant victories, Alcibiades decided the time for his return had come. His trireme entered the harbor of Piraeus, and what happened next was one of the most dramatic and emotional moments in the history of Athens. At first, he hesitated to come ashore, unsure of how he would be received by the city he had so cruelly betrayed. But when he saw his friends and relatives on the pier, he stepped onto the land. And at that moment, the entire city seemed to lose its mind. Huge crowds of people flooded into Piraeus to see their idol, their savior. It was the apotheosis of forgiveness, a moment when the people's love eclipsed the memory of all transgressions. People wept, they cheered, they reached out their hands to him, adorning his ship with wreaths. The elderly said it was the most magnificent spectacle they had ever seen, surpassing even the departure of the Sicilian Expedition. The assembly immediately cleared him of all charges. His confiscated property was returned. The priests who had once cursed his name were now forced to perform a ceremony and publicly retract their curses. But the Athenians went even further. In a surge of boundless trust and adoration, they elected him strategos autocrator, commander-in-chief of all land and sea forces with unlimited powers. Almost no one in the history of Athenian democracy had ever held such power. At this moment, the paradox of Alcibiades reached its zenith. The man who had advised the Spartans on how to starve Athens into submission now held absolute authority over that very city. Athens had, in effect, fallen to its knees before him, entrusting its fate to the one who had once trampled on its trust. It was his finest hour, the peak of his glory. He was not just forgiven, he was deified. But it was in this limitless adoration that a deadly danger lurked, because from such love to such boundless hatred was but a single step. Having received absolute power, Alcibiades found himself in a gilded cage of impossible expectations. The Athenians, intoxicated by his return and his past victories, no longer saw him as merely a talented commander. He had become for them a messiah, a demigod from whom they expected a miracle, the immediate and final defeat of Sparta and the restoration of the empire to its former glory. Any result short of a total, crushing victory would now be seen as a failure, a betrayal of their hopes. It was a moment of classic Greek tragedy, a moment of hubris, of pride, but this time not on the part of the hero, but on the part of an entire people who had created an idol for themselves. Alcibiades, for his part, did everything to reinforce this image. His first act as autocrat was a symbolic gesture of incredible boldness. He personally led a land-based force to escort the sacred procession from Athens to Eleusis. Since the Spartans had fortified Decelia, this land route had been cut off, and for many years the Athenians had been forced to conduct their sacred Eleusinian mysteries by sea. Alcibiades, in defiance of the Spartan army, led the procession by land, demonstrating that he had restored Athens' control even over its own territory. This gesture sparked a new wave of ecstasy. But war is not just about grand gestures. Alcibiades needed money for the fleet, new soldiers, resources, and the Athenian treasury was empty. He was forced to set out on a new campaign to raise funds and continue the war against the Spartan fleet, now commanded by a new, exceptionally talented and cunning admiral, Lysander. The weight of expectations pressed down on him. He no longer had any room for error. Every move was scrutinized by his old enemies in the city, who had lain low, waiting for an excuse to strike. The love of the crowd, as he knew better than anyone, was fickle and fleeting, and his pedestal, built on elation and hope, proved to be terrifyingly fragile. The catastrophe, as is often the case, came from an unexpected quarter, caused not by a grand defeat, but by a minor setback. Having set out in search of funds for the army, Alcibiades left the main fleet in the harbor of Notium, near Ephesus. He gave command to his friend and helmsman, Antiochus, with the strictest order. Under no circumstances was he to engage the Spartan fleet of Lysander before his return. But Antiochus, a brave but vain man, lacking strategic talent, decided to win some glory for himself in Alcibiades' absence. In violation of his orders, he took a few ships and tried to lure Lysander into a fight with a provocation. The cunning Spartan saw through his simple maneuver. He first attacked Antiochus' squadron with superior forces, and when the rest of the Athenian fleet, lacking unified command, rushed chaotically to the rescue, Lysander defeated them in detail. The Athenians lost about 15 ships. From a military standpoint, the defeat was not a disaster. The fleet remained combat-ready. But from a political standpoint, it was a death sentence for Alcibiades. As soon as news of the defeat at Notium reached Athens, his enemies immediately reared their heads. They blamed the commander-in-chief for everything. They shouted that instead of fighting, he was indulging in drunkenness and debauchery, leaving command to his worthless drinking buddies. They hinted that he had lost the battle intentionally, or that he was secretly in league with Lysander. The crowd, its boundless expectations betrayed, instantly forgot his triumphant return and his victories. Love turned to rage and suspicion. Alcibiades once again became the scapegoat, a convenient figure on whom to blame all failures. At the next election for generals, he wasn't re-elected. The paradox repeated itself as farce. He was raised to the pinnacle of power only to be cast down months later because of his subordinate's mistake. Alcibiades, still with the army, understood perfectly what this news meant for him. He knew the fickle nature of the Athenian people. He knew that what awaited him in the city was not retirement, but a trial, and most likely another death sentence. He did not tempt fate a second time. Without returning to Athens, without trying to justify himself before the assembly, he boarded his ship and left the Athenian army for good. He went into his second, this time voluntary and final, exile. His refuge was the Thracian Chersonese, a peninsula on the Hellespont, where he had his own lands and a fortified castle. Here, on the edge of the Hellenic world, he ceased to be an Athenian general and became, in essence, an independent warlord, a condottiero. He gathered a band of mercenaries and began to wage his own war against the local Thracian tribes, protecting the Greek cities on the coast and making a living by the sword. It was a tragic end to his career. The man who had dreamed of ruling empires, who had commanded the greatest fleets of his time and played with the fates of Athens, Sparta, and Persia, was now forced to languish on a barbarian frontier, engaged in minor border skirmishes. He was still relatively young, full of strength and energy, his genius undiminished. But the grand stage on which he was accustomed to performing was closed to him forever. He was a spectator as the war he had waged for so long approached its decisive stage, but he could no longer take part. He had been removed from the great game. But fate gave him one last chance to influence history, a chance to speak his final prophetic words, which, however, no one wanted to hear. The year is 405 BC. The entire weight of the war has shifted to the straits, through which Athens' grain flowed. The entire remaining Athenian fleet, more than 180 triremes, under the command of a group of new, self-confident generals, was stationed at a place called Aegospotami, which translates to Goat Rivers. The Spartan fleet, under Lysander, was positioned on the opposite shore in a well-protected harbor. From his castle nearby, Alcibiades observed the disposition of the Athenian forces, and his heart sank in horror. He, like no one else, understood the disastrous nature of the position his countrymen had taken. They were encamped on an open, unprotected beach, far from any city, which forced the sailors to scatter across the countryside every day in search of provisions. It was a tactical error bordering on madness, driven by either the remnants of patriotism or the desire to prove his superiority one last time. Alcibiades mounted his horse and rode to the Athenian camp. He approached the generals and began to plead with them to change their position immediately. He pointed out the obvious vulnerability of their camp. He proposed they move the fleet to the nearby harbor of Sestos, where they would have protection and a market. Furthermore, he offered them his help. He said that the local Thracian kings, his allies, were prepared to provide him with a large army, with which he could attack Lysander from the land, forcing the Spartans to either fight on unfavorable terms or retreat. It was a brilliant, life-saving plan. And at that moment, an act of the greatest historical folly occurred. The Athenian generals, notably Tydeus and Menander, arrogantly rejected his offer. They declared that they were in command now, not him. They dismissed him with contempt, fearing that in the event of victory, all the glory would go to him, and in the event of failure, he would simply flee again. This act is still debated. Was Alcibiades' offer sincere? Perhaps. Was his plan genius? Undoubtedly. Was rejecting it suicidal for Athens? Absolutely. Riding away from the Athenian camp, Alcibiades, according to the historian Xenophon, uttered a final, prophetic phrase. He said he was more worried about the recklessness of his own citizens than about the enemy. He had washed his hands of it. He had done all he could. He had offered salvation, but it was rejected. The subsequent events unfolded with the inevitability of a Greek tragedy. For several days, the Athenian fleet sailed out daily to the roadstead, challenging Lysander to battle, but he refused to engage. The Athenians, seeing the enemy's passivity, grew increasingly careless. Every evening they returned to their inconvenient beach, and the crews, just as Alcibiades had foreseen, wandered off in search of food. Lysander, cunning and patient, was waiting for precisely this moment. On the fifth day, when the Athenian ships had once again returned and their crews had disembarked, the Spartan fleet, on a prearranged signal, suddenly attacked. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Athenian ships, beached and crewless, were captured with almost no resistance. Of more than 180 triremes, only a handful managed to escape. Several thousand Athenian citizens who were taken captive were executed. It was a catastrophe that dwarfed even the destruction of the expedition in Sicily. In a single day, Athens lost its entire fleet, its last hope. When the news reached the city, a funeral wail spread through the streets. Everyone knew that this was the end. Alcibiades' prophecy had been fulfilled with terrifying accuracy. By rejecting their genius out of pride and envy, the Athenian commanders had committed an act of national suicide. The irony of fate was cruel. The man they considered their worst enemy and traitor turned out to be the only one who could have saved them, but they preferred to perish rather than accept his help. The rout at Aegospotami was a death blow to Athens. Deprived of its fleet, the city could no longer protect its sea lanes or import food. Lysander blockaded Piraeus, and the Spartan army approached the city walls from the land. Famine began. After several months of siege, having exhausted all resources and all hope, Athens surrendered. This happened in the year 404 BC. The terms of peace dictated by Sparta were humiliating. The Athenian naval empire ceased to exist. Athens was stripped of all its overseas possessions and the remnants of its fleet, except for 12 guard ships. But the most painful and symbolic demand was the destruction of the long walls, the magnificent fortifications that connected the city to its port of Piraeus and were the symbol of its maritime power. Plutarch writes that the walls were torn down to the music of flutes amid the joyful cries of the victors, who considered that day the beginning of freedom for all of Greece. In Athens itself, democracy was abolished, and a pro-Spartan puppet government, known to history as the 30 Tyrants, came to power. The dream of Pericles, of an eternal and invincible city hegemon, had turned to dust. And in this whole tragedy, the shadow of Alcibiades was invisibly present. He was the architect of the Sicilian Expedition, whose failure had bled the city dry. He was the one who had advised the Spartans to fortify Deceleia, which had doomed Attica to devastation. And he was the one whose final, prophetic warning had been rejected, leading to the final catastrophe. His life and fate were inextricably woven into the fabric of the rise and fall of Athens. He was both the creator of its imperial ambitions and the instrument of its destruction, a living embodiment of that very hubris which, in the Greek view, always leads to divine retribution. After Sparta's final victory and the establishment of the 30 tyrants' rule in Athens, one of whom, by the way, was Critias, a former associate of Alcibiades, the exile's position became even more precarious. He understood that in the new Greece, dominated by Sparta, there was no place for him. Lysander, the de facto ruler of the Hellenic world, saw him as a constant threat. Alcibiades was too clever, too unpredictable, too charismatic to be left alive. He could at any moment forge a new coalition, find new patrons, and overturn the chessboard once again. In search of a new refuge, Alcibiades once more turned his gaze eastward. He went to Phrygia, to the Persian satrap Pharnabazus, hoping to reach the Persian king Artaxerxes himself and offer his services, perhaps nurturing a new grand plan, a campaign of united Greek forces against Sparta with Persian support. But his enemies acted faster. An unambiguous demand was sent from Sparta to Pharnabazus: hand over Alcibiades or kill him. The Persian satrap, unwilling to quarrel with the victors of the Peloponnesian War, chose the latter. He entrusted this dirty work to his brother and a band of mercenaries. They tracked Alcibiades to a small village where he was living with his companion, Timandra. He became the last victim of the Great War, its bloody epilogue. The greatest powers of the time, Sparta and Persia, united with the new rulers of Athens to destroy one man, because his genius, even in exile, inspired in them all an overwhelming fear. The hunt for Alcibiades was the final acknowledgement of his exceptionalism. He was too great to be ignored and too dangerous to be allowed to live. The death of Alcibiades was as dramatic and theatrical as his entire life. The assassins, afraid to face him in open combat even with superior numbers, decided to act from a distance. At night, they surrounded his wooden house and set it on fire. Awakening to the heat and the smell of smoke, Alcibiades instantly assessed the situation. He had no armor, no heavy weapons, but he was not going to die in a fire like a cornered animal. He wrapped his left arm in his cloak to use as a shield and took his dagger in his right. With a battle cry, he burst out of the burning house, charging directly at his murderers. His appearance was so terrifying, his desperate courage so astounding, that none of the mercenaries dared to approach him. They fell back and began to rain arrows and javelins on him from a distance. He died before he could reach his enemies, pierced by dozens of shafts, alone in the Phrygian night. Thus ended the journey of the man who had been the darling of Athens, the advisor to Spartan kings, and the friend of Persian satraps. He was buried by his faithful companion, Timandra, who wrapped his body in her own expensive robes. His end was a perfect metaphor for his entire life. Brilliance and courage, surrounded by betrayal and fire, and a death in complete solitude, far from the homeland that had created, worshipped, and cursed him. It was the end, not just of a man, but of an era of bold individualism, great ambitions, and tragic mistakes. His death closed the circle. Born at the center of the world, he died on its margins, but even in his demise, he remained true to himself, unbroken, fierce, and unforgettable. The legacy of Alcibiades proved to be as contradictory and paradoxical as the man himself. Immediately after his death, a debate began that continues to this day. Who was he really? Historians who were his contemporaries give completely different answers to this question. Thucydides, the stern and objective analyst, acknowledges his outstanding talents, but believes that his exile due to unfounded suspicions was the main reason for Athens' defeat in the war. For Thucydides, the tragedy of Alcibiades is the tragedy of a democracy that could not manage genius and, out of envy and fear, destroyed both him and itself. Xenophon, a student of Socrates, paints a more negative picture, emphasizing his lack of principle, his selfishness, and his corruption, which ultimately led to his downfall. For him, Alcibiades is a textbook example of how the greatest gifts, without a moral core, lead to catastrophe. Later, in the Roman era, Plutarch, a master of the biographical genre, would create the most complex and multifaceted portrait of him. He does not attempt a definitive judgment. He shows us a man woven from extremes, incredibly gifted, yet monstrously flawed, capable of the greatest patriotism and the basest betrayal, charming and repulsive at the same time. For Plutarch, Alcibiades is an eternal enigma, the perfect material for meditating on human nature, on glory and infamy. In subsequent centuries, his image continued to captivate minds. For some, he was a symbol of the Renaissance Titan, a man who places his own will above all laws. For others, he was a warning about the dangers of demagoguery and political adventurism. He became a timeless archetype, the genius without a conscience, the charismatic leader who leads his people to the abyss, the brilliant opportunist for whom homeland is merely a bargaining chip in the game of personal power. This debate can never be resolved because Alcibiades, as in a mirror, reflected all the brightest and darkest sides, not only of Athenian democracy, but of human nature itself. So who was he? A genius or an unprincipled villain? The answer his story offers is more complex than a simple either-or. The key to the paradox of Alcibiades lies in the fact that he was not just a man, but the extreme, absolute embodiment of the spirit of his city. Athens. The Athens of the 5th century BC was a city of boundless individualism, relentless energy, and all-consuming ambition. Alcibiades was the distillation of this essence. He did not separate himself from Athens. In his own mind, he was Athens in its highest form. His love for the city was a form of self-love. He sincerely believed that what was good for Alcibiades was good for Athens. As long as the city provided him a stage for his triumph, crowned him with laurels, and applauded his genius, he was its most devoted son. He led it to glory, because his glory was the glory of Athens. But the moment the democratic system, with its checks and balances, and its suspicion of any one man's excessive elevation, threatened his personal safety and status, his logic inverted. In his eyes, it was not he who was betraying Athens, but Athens that was betraying him, betraying its own greatness, which he embodied. His betrayals were not acts of ideological apostasy. In betraying Athens to Sparta, he was taking revenge not on the city, but on the political faction that he believed had unjustly condemned him. In playing games with Persia, he was trying to create a situation where Athens would be forced to once again recognize his indispensability. Even his final advice at Aegospotami was the gesture of a man screaming, "Only I know how to save you." He was a genius, but a genius who lacked the chief quality of a statesman, the ability to place the interests of society above his own. And he was a villain, but not in a Shakespearean sense. Rather, he was a tragic hero whose greatest strength, his boundless ego, became the cause of his downfall and the ruin of his homeland. Ultimately, the story of Alcibiades is not just the biography of one man, but a timeless philosophical treatise on the nature of power, genius, and democracy. It asks us uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. What should a society do with individuals whose talent and charisma are so great that they begin to threaten the very foundations of that society? Where is the line at which admiration for a leader turns into a dangerous idolatry that blinds an entire nation? The story of Alcibiades is the tragedy of charisma devoid of a moral compass. It shows how easily the brilliance of individuality, unrestrained by any internal or external breaks, can transform from a creative force into a destructive hurricane. Alcibiades was the living embodiment of the dilemma that every free system faces. It produces great individuals, but it also fears them. It needs their energy for its achievements, but constantly worries that this energy will be turned against it. The fate of Athens and its favorite son is a universal warning. It tells us that the most dangerous enemy is often born not outside the city walls, but within them, nurtured by our own admiration. It reminds us that between a savior and a destroyer, between a genius and a villain, there is sometimes not an abyss, but a line as thin as a razor's edge, and its name is hubris. And the story of Alcibiades, the darling of Athens who betrayed his homeland, will forever serve as a reminder of how easily that line can be crossed, dragging an entire world into the void.